So at the moment, I registered just one route here, this tasks route, and that would ensure that if we visit our domain, so in my case here, localhost 4200 during development, /tasks, this component here would be loaded. Now, if you try doing that though, you'll see that nothing changed. And the reason for that is that Angular doesn't know where to render this tasks component. Sure, we're telling it that this is the component that should be loaded for this path, but thankfully, Angular does not automatically replace your entire UI with that component, because that's typically not what you want. For example, we have a header here, which we probably want to reuse across different routes. So replacing the entire screen with the component we're defining here is typically not what we want. So Angular makes no assumptions regarding that, thankfully. And therefore, you need to tell Angular where to render this component. And you do so by going to your app component, which is still the component with which the entire application starts. That's still the main component that gets rendered initially. And in that app component template, you then need to place a marker for Angular so that it understands where it should render that route content. And you do that with help of a special directive, which you can output in your template. And here I want to replace this to-do paragraph with that special directive. And that would be the router outlet directive. Now that's a directive which by default is not understood by Angular, but you can of course teach it about that by going to your component TypeScript file and to the component decorator, and by adding router outlet, which must be imported to the imports array here. That unlocks this directive, and that's then in the end a placeholder or a marker, to be precise, that tells Angular where the loaded component that's loaded because of routing should be rendered. And it will be rendered next to this router outlet, below it to be precise. Well, and with that, if you save that, things will change. Now you can see this, there are no tasks yet. Start adding some text as I'm navigating to /tasks. And if I go back to just localhost 4200, there's nothing here. If I go back to /tasks, this text reappears. And as you can see, if you inspect this text here, this app tasks component here, this one here, is rendered next to this router outlet. And that is how routing works and how you ensure that routes are displayed on the screen. But of course, with that, we still don't really have a lot of routes in this application. So that's what will change next. So let's add a second route to this application. And I want to add a route that should be active right from the start if we visit just localhost 4200 without any path thereafter. Of course, we can see all this content in that case, but that's only the case because this content is part of the app component template. I'm outputting the header and the users component there. And as I explained before, this component is rendered initially. That's the main component of our application. And routing then kind of takes place inside of it with help of the router outlet. But that's why this area is pretty empty initially, because we don't have any route for that no path case here. And that's exactly what I want to change. Now I do already have a component which I want to show in that case, because I do have a no task component which simply says select a user to see their tasks. And it's this no task component that should be loaded if we visit an empty path. Therefore, I'll add another route object, and the order doesn't matter too much here. if we're dealing with different paths, if we would have similar paths, then the order would matter because the routes are resolved from top to bottom. But I still personally like to order my routes such that they become more complex from top to bottom. So the simple routes at the top and then the more complex nested ones down there. And I want to add a new route here which has an empty path for your domain, like localhost 4200/nothing, or even no slash at all. That's what this path here will represent. And as a component, I want to load this no task component, which is imported from the appropriate folder. And that's then all. We already have the router outlet in place, so we don't need to do anything regarding that. And therefore here, if I go back, I see that select a user text from that no task component if I haven't selected a user yet. And if I visit /tasks, that changes to this fallback text. And that proves that this basic routing is working. As a next step, it would of course be nice if we wouldn't have to change the URL manually, because no one does that. Instead, it would be nice if we could click these users. So if we had links we could interact with, that would lead to these different routes being loaded. And that's therefore what we'll take care of next. So let's make sure that we got some actual links here that load different routes. And for that, I'll go to my users component. And there, it's actually the user component, which I want to visit. So this component here, because it's in there, in the template of this component, where I already am rendering an anchor tag. So I already do have links here for these user items, but at the moment, these links aren't doing anything. This anchor tag has no configuration that would cause it to trigger a navigation. And we can, of course, change that by adding the href attribute here, for example, and by setting this to a path we want to navigate to, because that's how links work. So here we could want to navigate to /tasks, for example. Later, we might want to make sure that the user ID is kind of encoded in the URL so that we can load different tasks for different users. But for the moment, to keep it simple, I'll just navigate to tasks like this. With that, if we save this, we can click those users and you see the URL updated. But you'll also see something else. Every time I click a user, the app briefly flickers here. So it looks like the entire page is reloading on every navigation. In addition, if you open the developer tools and you go to the network tab, you will notice that for every navigation, all these files here are loaded again. So the entire page is loaded again and all the JavaScript files are loaded again. And that happens for every navigation. And that's not ideal because since we're in a single page application where Angular is powering the UI, it would be nice if we could stay in that single page application and if we wouldn't unnecessarily reload the page all the time. Because refetching that same one single index.html file and all the JavaScript files that are needed by this application over and over again does not make any sense and instead leads to a worse user experience, also because refetching all these files can slow our application down. That's why you typically don't want to navigate by using a regular link with that href attribute. You could do it, but it's not the preferred way because it would lead to the page being loaded again and again and again. So instead of using this href attribute for setting up a link, you should typically, in an Angular application, use the router link directive, which is a directive offered by Angular, even though it doesn't start with ng, but it's still offered by Angular. And it is a directive that will in the end set up a path for this link, but Angular will then block the browser default behavior, which would be to refetch the HTML document. And instead, Angular will take over, will take a look at the path you want to navigate to, and it will then take a look at the route configuration and load and render the appropriate component without leaving that single page application world. That's what RouterLink does for you. Therefore, RouterLink wants an input value, which is still that path you want to navigate to. But now Angular will take over and will make sure that the appropriate content is shown on the screen. Now, if you would save it like this, you'd run into a problem though. If you now click on a user, nothing happens. And the reason for that is that, as I mentioned, RouterLink is a directive offered by Angular, but as you learned before in the course, by default, out of the box, directives aren't auto-detected or anything like that. So you must make Angular aware of the fact that you're using this directive in this component, and you're doing that by adding this imports array to that component decorator. And there you would add the router link directive, which must be imported from @AngularRouter. With that now done, if you save and reload, you will be able to click on a user and you see the URL changed to /tasks. But now if you switch between users, which is currently not reflected on the UI, but as you click on different users, the page will not flicker. And if you take a look at the network tab, you see no new requests are sent. For that initial request, from /nothing to /tasks, there is one request being sent here because some image is refetched here, but that's all. All the HTML and JavaScript files are not fetched again. And that's therefore how you set up links when using the Angular router.